Daria, if the client had already been here and had such requests, she would do everything to overcome her resistance and make the girl agree to it. Hi, welcome to another episode of Criminal Patrol. Someone in this case, one of the lawyers, said that prostitution was, is, and will be. And it's hard to disagree with that because, after all, it's the oldest profession in the world. Probably the law also, I think, somewhat agrees that prostitution is something that basically has to exist. Because as you remember, I've talked about this before, prostitution exists. In Poland, it is not punishable, but all those, I would say, related offenses are punishable. From prostitution, meaning pimping, procuring, or inducing prostitution, so to sum up, all those who profit from prostitution. Krakow, just like other cities in Poland, has basically always been a place where there were various kinds of brothels. The oldest one was probably in the Krakow Gate. Probably everyone who has come to Krakow knows the Krakow Gate. There was the first, let's call it, escort agency run by executioners back then, and then gradually all these services developed, and today that's more or less what we'll be talking about. I invite you to watch the next episode.
If you value reliable, evidence-based investigations and want us to uncover Poland's criminal mysteries, become a patron of Kryminalny Patrol. Your support directly translates into bold reports, access to archives, and on-site reporting trips, thanks to which we uncover the mechanisms of crime. Join our community today. Click the support button below the video. We welcome our new supporters, Mateusz Adam Katana, Kamil WPR, and Blan S. We warmly greet our regular patrons who collaborate with us. They support us at the highest levels. Mona Monika, Anna Maria KRK, Kinga Struska, Wira, Dorota Kowalówka, Jarosław Jarociński, Dawid Grobecki, and Tomasz Stępień.
With the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, millions of Ukrainians moved toward Poland and generally toward the borders of Europe. Among them were hundreds of thousands of young women, including prostitutes who had previously worked in Ukraine. Some of the people who fled were really escaping the war, while others left just in case. Still others simply took advantage of the situation, hoping that maybe they would find a better new life somewhere here. But among those women who were fleeing, as I said, there were also prostitutes who worked in Ukraine. In Poland, this is nothing new because prostitutes have been around for many, many years, working in Krakow, Warsaw, Poznan, Wrocław, so they were well known. Among those young women who came to Poland, there were also some who decided to work in the world's oldest profession, even though they had no previous experience. Their fate varies, it's different for each of them. I'm referring to one of those cases that was recently handled right here in Krakow. This case went to trial. It also shows the mechanism behind everything that happens to some women, young women from Ukraine who come here. This is one of those places right now as we stand here. I would say it's quite historic in some way in Krakow. This is Biskupia Street. People often say Biskupi Square, but actually it's Biskupia Street. It's rather unusual because there are two one-way roads that basically make a loop, and literally that's what this place was called. The Kółko. Basically, there were two kółka in Krakow. One big one which started already from the train station. It went along the streets of Krakow, and the second one, the so-called small loop, because as you can see, this square is surrounded by two roads. You can drive around this square, a kind of loop like this, where you can circle around Cars used to drive along these streets, and next to them stood ladies who showed off their charms. There were really a lot of those ladies. In Krakow, people used to say that if someone was going to see prostitutes, they would say, "I'm going to the Loop," and everyone knew what that meant. Well, the cars would drive, as I said, in circles. The driver would stop, the ladies would come over, they'd agree on the type of service and the price, and the lady would get in. They would basically drive not far, somewhere nearby, either to a parking lot or some more secluded place. The whole service lasted only about 15 minutes, no more, because of course the next client was waiting. The money, let's say, was rather small. In this situation, oral sex was 50 to 100 zlotys. Another type was 150 to 200, 150 to 250 zlotys, more or less. At that time, a prostitute could earn about 800 zlotys in one night. I said it's a bit of history, although not that distant. When we were working, the Loop in Krakow was still operating. There were quite a few women standing here. Of course, most of them were Polish women, but among the Polish women, most were from Silesia. They came here most often, and besides them, there were also Czech, Romanian, and of course, Ukrainian women. Well, today, of course, these kinds of loops are already history. Well, today I would say that this first contact, which used to be with prostitutes, has been replaced by women answering clients' calls. Well, of course, it matters less what they look like and more how they speak. What matters most is that seductive voice, the kind that would keep the client on the line and encourage him, giving him a taste of the experiences that are still waiting for him. Of course, basically everything has moved to the internet, shifted to erotic websites and to various types of go-go clubs. Testers, all kinds of people who promote these kinds of services. Well, today I would say it's already a developed business, where there's even a clear kind of division of roles, who does what. So I would say women standing out on the street. Of course, this still happens, but it's becoming less and less common. Basically, we can say that everything that happens in this industry today is found on the internet. Dagmara is a prostitute. Basically, she used to be a very active prostitute. I would say she has huge experience in this industry. She worked in Poland and she also worked in Sweden. Some time ago, she stopped having direct contact with clients and started focusing more on organizing this kind of services. On November 14, 2021, from one of the apartments, basically an escort agency in one of the apartments on Limanowskiego Street in Krakow. Police officers from the criminal division of the provincial police headquarters in Krakow investigated this group, this agency, and entered the premises. They arrested Dagmara. She was sentenced in 2023, but at the same time, Daria was also arrested at this agency. Daria, on the other hand, is a 29-year-old Ukrainian woman born in Enerhodar. She came to Poland a few years ago. First, she lived in Wrocław. That's where she met Vladislav, a 28-year-old Ukrainian man. They both liked each other. Vladislav, on the other hand, was born in Kharkiv. And so there in Wrocław, they started thinking about how to start a business. They came to the conclusion that as a result of the war and everything happening in Ukraine, thousands of young Ukrainian women are coming to Poland, among other places. They came to the conclusion that they could simply take advantage of them by recruiting them into escort agencies and, of course, make money this way. Both of them approached this very professionally. Daria was mainly responsible for dealing with clients. Her task was to recruit a network of female phone operators here, meaning women who have that seductive voice. She was also responsible for supervising the staff. Above all, she maintained a certain kind of discipline among the girls. She also organized shifts, substitutions, and the days when something came up for one of the girls or something happened. Well, these kinds of things always happen in any company. She was kind of a cross between, let's say, an executive director in a company. In this case, we said she was a cross between an executive director and a madam or a brothel madam, because those terms are also used. Meanwhile, Władysław was a kind of director of marketing and promotion. His task, on the other hand, was to post various types of advertisements and announcements on websites and online. Of course, good photos had to be taken. He also hired good photographers for that. These photos ended up on the girls' profiles in seductive poses. Yes, the kind that made people look. Potential clients decided to call the agency. He also recruited drivers whose job was to take the girls to work. Founded by Daria and Władysław, it started its operations around April 2023, and indeed the company was bringing huge profits. The business was taking off. They had ideas, they had enthusiasm for work. The business was growing so much that they had to hire more women answering the phones and more drivers, more photographers, and most importantly, recruiters. A recruiter is a person who simply searched for the right ladies. They often showed up, for example, at the train station where there were the most people fleeing from Ukraine. They talked to women, offered them jobs, promised them money, and indeed many women decided to work this way. It's hard to say how many women they recruited. However, there were definitely a lot of them. Well, all of this meant that the business run by both of them kept bringing in huge profits. And it seemed like everything would keep going well. But it also seems that there was some kind of conflict between Daria and Władysław. No, you can't rule out that this was the reason. That Daria simply fell in love with Władysław. She was jealous of his interactions with the girls, or rather with one of them. It seemed like the whole business would fall apart because of that feeling, but in the end, common sense prevailed. And they decided to talk it over after all, to reach some kind of consensus so that they wouldn't lose anything in all of this. Everything they had managed to achieve so far. And in fact, here Daria did resent Władysław over those contacts of his. He, on the other hand, had complaints about Daria and the way she managed the girls, but they worked it out. It ended with them removing one of the girls from the agency. Apparently the whole dispute was about this particular girl, and the whole business kept going. That was when Daria and Władysław's business really took off. Władysław then met Denis, another Ukrainian. Władysław told him about how you can make money off women in Poland. Denis liked the idea. He came to the conclusion that he could do it too. And he would start his own escort agency. You could say it was the parent company. The company that belonged to Daria and Władysław. And indeed, Denis got his business going. He had no problem recruiting more girls from Ukraine. And just like that other company, he had to hire drivers, he had to hire recruiters, phone operators. However, he didn't have to hire a photographer because he took pretty good photos himself. He took those photos of the girls and he posted them on various websites. We also don't know, because that's currently the subject of the investigation, what kind of relationship connected Władysław and Denis here. It's not out of the question that something else might come up in this case, because Władysław provided Denis, as they put it, with human resources. In other words, prostitutes from Władysław's agency worked for Denis. But in return, he didn't charge anything, no money at all. So what was the arrangement between them? What kind of transaction was it? Presumably that will come out during the investigation. In any case, those two agencies were working hard to the extent that they had to hire additional employees, which I mentioned. But they also came to the conclusion that they could expand it to other cities in Poland, not just Krakow, and that's how it happened. Escort agencies appeared. Of course, they were usually based on short-term rentals, using apartments rented in other cities. And that's how on the map of these agencies, Warsaw, Poznan and Wrocław appeared. So as you can see, it was already a real network of this kind of services throughout Poland. Of course, I told you that the women answering the phones played an immense role in this business, and their task was to attract customers. If a customer called, then everything had to be done to make sure he decided to visit the agency. Alternatively, that a prostitute would come to his home. So the role of the women answering the phones was important. And this is where the problem with Daria's management came in. She tended to keep the prostitutes under a firm hand. They had their own kind of service catalog. Some of them didn't want to cross certain boundaries. For example, they didn't agree to have unprotected sex, or they didn't agree to anal sex. But Daria, if the client was already there and had these kinds of requests, she would do everything to break those boundaries so that the girl would agree to it after all. And that's often what caused those misunderstandings. Drivers also played a very important role because, well, it wasn't just an ordinary driver who was supposed to take the prostitute to the client's apartment. Well, he also acted as a kind of bodyguard. His task was also to check if everything was okay in the apartment, to see if there weren't any other people, to see if there weren't any cameras. And also an important function was that he had to pay special attention to how the girl looked. Whether she has nice makeup, whether she's nicely dressed, whether she's available, because it varied. If it turned out that the girl wasn't in good condition, or she had bad makeup, or was dressed poorly, then his job was to inform the management, and the management, of course, would take action. Of course, in this industry, earnings are important, probably the most important, because it's the earnings that mainly attract people to do this kind of work. These earnings are not small. In this case, the girl could earn from about 3,500 to 4,500 euros per week. Well, if we look at it monthly, that's about 16,000 to 18,000 euros. You can roughly estimate that's about 80,000 zlotys per month. Well, that's a pretty decent income. Probably only comparable to those in state-owned companies, so it's definitely worth fighting for. Of course, about half of that money went to the agency owners, so the girl was left with half. Still, that's quite a lot. There were also individual arrangements, let's call them contracts. For a night, for example, 800 zlotys, 1,200. But sometimes there was a client, especially a foreign one, who would pay 8,000 zlotys for one night. So definitely not a small amount. And above all, I think it was the earnings that attracted the girls to this job. Of course, most of these girls, Ukrainians, worked and were aware of what they were getting into and what their job would involve. Probably not all of them knew the full extent of everything they would have to do, but essentially they knew what they were signing up for. However, there are also cases, and in this investigation there is also the story of a young, attractive Ukrainian woman who came to Poland during the war. She met Valery here, another Ukrainian Valery. It seems that he's just a con artist. He manipulated the girl and took her ATM card. And he just lived off her. He kept telling her that he had connections in the business, that she would work in modeling. He even took her measurements so he could pass them on to have an attractive dress made for her. Well, he kept sweet-talking her all the time, to put it bluntly. At that time, he was talking with Daria and Vladimir about simply handing her over to the agency so that she would work for them. The girl thought she would be working, but in a, let's say, slightly different profession. There's something called being an escort. It's basically a woman there to keep someone company, especially at parties, banquets, or business events. Well, such ladies are also in demand. So she thought she would be working in this way. Basically, Valery convinced this girl that because of her he has debts, that she has to work at Daria's agency. And she simply has to work off the money he lost because of her. It just ended up with the girl working at the agency. She was a prostitute. And all the money she earned was taken by the agency to cover those debts. So, well, you could see that the girl was probably also in some kind of trance or depression. Well, you could clearly see that she just wasn't thinking logically. Well, that network of pimps was operating. The whole business was running roughly from April 2023 to May 2024. That's when, in May, about a year ago, the first arrests started happening in Krakow. In total, 18 people have been arrested so far. Most of them, of course, were directly connected to the agency. Drivers, prostitutes, call operators, but there were also photographers. I would say it's not just people who were somehow involved or closely connected with the agency, but also people who work every day and have normal homes. Among others, there was a photographer from Krakow, a married man with 2 children. Well, he just came to the conclusion that he simply could. He could make money from all this, and that's what happened. Just a few days ago, an indictment was filed in Krakow, in the Krakow court, so the whole court proceedings are just about to begin. We'll see how it ends. Right now, Daria and Władysław are charged with leading a criminal group and with pimping. Dennis, who ran the other agency, faces the same charges. Valery, that same cunning Valery who manipulated the young Ukrainian woman, is charged with human trafficking. We'll see what sentences they get. Presumably, this case will also develop further because this is the main thread among the side threads, such as the ties between Valery and Dennis and how they settled up, are also something of a mystery. So this will also be the subject of the proceedings, so we'll probably learn a lot more about this case. In today's episode, we showed what is happening behind the scenes of everything related to the war. the fate of many girls, young women who are also coming to Poland. Probably the same mechanism occurs not only in Poland, but also in other countries where young Ukrainian women arrive. As you can see, this fate can be different. Also, probably the scale of the phenomenon is much larger. It's hard to estimate. Once, when I started working on today's report about Biskupia Street, back then there were about 300 to 400 prostitutes in Krakow. Today it's probably hundreds, maybe even thousands. It's impossible to determine that scale either. So probably if there was no demand, there wouldn't be any supply either. So probably, going back to where I started, the law itself is also somehow powerless. It thinks that's just how it has to be, because prostitution is not punished. And that's it for today's episode. Of course, subscribe to our channel, and traditionally, of course, hold back.
If you value reliable, evidence-based investigations and want the criminal mysteries of Poland to have no secrets from us, become a patron of Kryminalny Patrol. Your support directly translates into bold reports. Access to archives and field trips allow us to uncover the mechanisms of crime. Join our community today. Click the support button below the video. We welcome our new supporters, Mateusz Adam Katana, Kamil WPR, and Blanez. We warmly greet our regular patrons who support us at the highest levels. Mona Monika, Anna Maria Kajerka, Kinga Srusko, Uwira, Dorota Kowalówka, Jarosław Jarociński, Dawid Grobecki, see you. Nas na najwyższych progach. Monę Monikę, Annę Marię Kajerka, Kingę Strusko, Uwirę, Dorotę Kowalówkę, Jarosława Jarocińskiego, Dawida Grobeckiego